Well, when I was first asked to present at this conference, I called it Tales from the Dark Side, a Landlord's Perspective, because according to some, we're all evil scoundrels. But we press on.
Well, let me introduce myself, if I may. My name is Leonard Payne, and for over 20 years, I served in the Church of England in Suffolk. I was the vicar of 5 small rural parishes in the northeast of the county, the largest of which had a population of 850 and the smallest with a population of 14. For 12 of those years, I was a trustee of a local charity for homeless men, Adam Outreach Project, and in my retirement years, I still act as an advisor. That's me looking younger and far more interesting. What I'm going to be covering today is one, talking about our local registered charity and how we started and our relationships with the local authority. 2, some recommendations on how to have good relationships with your local landlords. I may pause for a bit of Q&A there, but the majority of my time is going to be 3, looking at the Supported Housing Regulatory Oversight Act, which I've been asked to do. So, firstly, our registered charity. Adam Outreach Project. The charity was founded in 2007 by a group of local Christians from various churches who were concerned about the number of single men being homeless in the nearby seaside town of Lowestoft. So we got together and purchased via a mortgage 2 seafront properties. Here they are, and we got to work. We didn't have a clue about what we were doing. We just wanted to help. We had no idea what an HMO license was, and our idea was of a fair rent was to look at the LHA rate, which was about £80 a week, and said, yeah, that'll do. Well, it didn't. Essentially, we were a bunch of well-meaning amateurs, and we soon found that we were subsidising the whole operation out of our own pockets. And any money we had burnt a hole in our pockets. So that's an airy lounge in one of our properties. I must admit, we've never had a problem with our local authority. I guess this is because as a registered charity, we've been totally transparent about our finances and the costs of running the operation. There have been occasional misunderstandings. 2 examples. Firstly, the night manager. Now, for many years, we had a resident manager who provided night management services free of charge. But when she retired, we needed to employ a night manager, which added considerably to the weekly rent. The initial questions which were raised were to do with why we needed to employ someone, but once we covered that question, there arose the how much of the night manager's time was spent on support, which is not covered by housing benefit, of course. The council wrote to us saying, quote, we also need to make a distinction between providing for the security of the individual with the dwelling and securing the dwelling itself. Service charges connected with the former are not eligible, while those for the latter often can be. Well, in another context, I might argue that providing for the security of the individual, especially vulnerable adults, is akin to routine health and safety and is eligible in full in accordance with Schedule 1.1G. Now, we were asked how much of the night manager's time was spent on support, and it was a difficult question to answer without analysis over a 12-month period. And if we were going to do an analysis like that, needed to be paid for. Now, one night it might be 40% of the time. Another night, it might only be 2% of the time spent on support. Now, we eventually agreed that the figure of 15% represented a reasonable average, and it was this amount that was deducted from the figures for the night manager. Secondly, the costs associated with white goods and equipment. I always worked on the basis that which can be measured can be controlled. So, for example, a washing machine costing £300 and with an amortization period of 3 years comes to £100 per year, divided by 15 residents makes about 13 pence per week per resident. Now do that with every single item, every single knife and fork on an Excel sheet. Some of you might remember Phil Hammond, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who was known as Spreadsheet Phil. The man's an amateur. So questions get raised as to how we calculate the period of use, etc., etc. We didn't go to Harrods, and the costs were based on Argos. I know that on the HB Info board there was a discussion about whether a landlord actually bought them and where are the receipts. In my opinion, they're not necessary. It's missing the point. They don't need to have purchased them. The charge is a fixed service charge for the use of furniture and white goods set by reference to a standard basket of items. It's not a variable cost recovery charge. I guess that I guess that most of the misunderstandings were basically the need for the local authority to be able to explain to the auditor. The biggie is the setting of the rents each year. I recall that in April 2023, we increased by less than the 6% allowed in some cases, and certainly less than the RPI plus 1% that we could have been allowed. But still, the toys get thrown out of the pram. Now, we never had a formal restriction or a tribunal case. We eventually got up, and to change the metaphor, we learned how to dance, and we came to a compromise acceptable to all. That's one of our therapists at work. Ongoing relations are generally good, although sometimes we have to start all over again if we're dealing with new staff who are not aware of the backstory. We recently took on a new property which increases our number of residents. As this was regarded as a new project, there were lots of hoops to jump through before the local authority accepted this as exempt accommodation. However, all of the problems or misunderstandings can be solved by discussion and transparency. So moving on to part 2, how to have good relationships with landlords. Well, first of all, we know there are rogue landlords, the cowboys as I call them. The short answer, indeed the only answer, is to talk to them. Talking achieves a number of objectives. Further information and data points can be gathered, and understanding of each other's viewpoints can be given. The problem is that the real rogues just won't engage. We saw that in Birmingham, where efforts were made to engage with landlords, but the only people who refused to engage were the rogues. I think once you get to this point, then you have to rely upon the legislation to deal with it. I believe there's going to be places inside the new Supported Housing Oversight Act where you would be able to act. But I'll say more about that in the third section today. So, how do you relate to the good guys? Well, the answer is the same. Talk. Those providing a good quality service and great support have their own problems to deal with. We do. As a small charity, we have our fair share, and I'm sure larger charities, such as the Salvation Army, have theirs as well. But the answer is engage in conversation. I'm convinced from experience that local authorities, once they have some clarity on the landlord's operation, are more amenable. As I've said before, transparency helps all. But transparency is a two-way street. Local authorities need to be clear to landlords as to what their needs are. And if you're having a problem with an item that might not get past your auditor, explain that. Banging the table doesn't help. Engage. So the answer is always talk. Carry out a conversation. Share. Perhaps engage in a discussion about best practices, for example. One of the lessons we learned during what I call the plague years was the use of online resources to conduct meetings. Well, it may be that a good way to have those conversations with landlords is to use Zoom or Microsoft Teams or something like that. You can share and talk about best practices or lessons learned. Now, I'm always happy to help facilitate those sessions or help set them up. There's my phone number. Give me a bell. So, moving on to section 3, the Supported Housing Regulatory Oversight Act 2023. It's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? And usually draft legislation is a wonderful cure for insomnia. Personally, I found it quite exciting, which proves one thing: I must get out more. So where did this bill come from? A little history. Concerns about the quality of exempt accommodation have been around for some time. And a few years ago, we started to see quite a bit of media attention on the problem, and local authorities and providers started raising the alarm. Initially, this was focused on areas like Birmingham, which seemed to be having a disproportionate scale of the problem. And the ongoing and increasing noise caught the attention of the government. And in 2021, the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, hereinafter called DLUC, funded 4 supported housing improvement pilots. However, the increasing noise about exempt accommodation in particular wasn't going away, and in early 2022, the then Homelessness Minister, Eddie Hughes, announced a further package of work tackling the, quote, unscrupulous landlords who exploit vulnerable residents by charging high rents for poor quality accommodation, end quote. And this included nearly 20 million to roll out a programme and a commitment to introduce minimum standards of support. And in early summer 2022, DLUC started a consultation work on what potential standards and regulation might look like. Now, around the same time, the Levelling Up Communities and Housing Select Committee launched an inquiry into supported exempt accommodation. They published their report and were shocked by their findings. They stated, quote, "There are many good providers, but in the worst instances, the system involves the exploitation of vulnerable people who should be receiving support, while unscrupulous providers make excessive profits by capitalising on loopholes," end quote. And the committee came out in support of regulation. Now, an important piece of context for the bill is the fact that in March 2022, the government committed to make some regulatory changes in response to the problems that we were hearing about across the country. And these changes included a commitment to introduce minimum standards for support, new powers for councils to act where provision of support and accommodation is inadequate, and a revised definition of care, support, and supervision. And then, by chance, I don't actually believe in chance, Bob Blackman MP was drawn in the ballot to introduce a private members bill. This is a bill introduced by an individual MP and not based on planned legislation. Now, normally these bills don't become law, but Bob has precedent. The Homelessness Reduction Act was introduced as a private members bill from Bob when he was last drawn in the ballot. Now, working alongside Crisis, the housing charity, Bob decided to focus his bill on introducing regulation of exempt accommodation, and the Supported Housing Regulatory Oversight Bill was born. Bob Blackman's bill importantly created parliamentary time for the government to act on these proposals, but it didn't give a huge amount of time to go through a consultation process to develop the legislation. And so the decision was taken to focus mainly on enabling provisions in the bill, with the detail, which means the development of the detailed operation of the bill, will be subject to consultation and further parliamentary scrutiny now that the bill has passed. Also worth saying at this stage that there has been an acknowledgement from the Minister that there will be a new burdens funding requirement. However, funding for support is not within the scope of the bill. Now, I know that many people are likely to share the view that the lack of revenue funding for housing-related support has been a driver for the growth of problematic parts. But because of the nature of a private members bill, it's not possible to address these kinds of issues. Now, I'm aware that the housing charity Crisis accepted the fact that this piece of work is about focusing on how we improve regulation and oversight. Let's look at some of the key players in this act. Firstly, Bob Blackman, Conservative MP for Harrow East. He drew high in the ballot for private members bill and introduced this one. He comes with a particular track record in the homelessness area and was responsible, as I said, for the successful implementation of the Homelessness Reduction Act. Secondly, we have Lord Best, Richard Best. He's a crossbencher or an independent in the House of Lords. He also has a track record in the homelessness area and was at one time a key player in the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, a small L liberal social welfare organisation. Next, we have the Secretary of State for DLUC, the Right Honourable Michael Gove. Kept a low profile recently, but he is known for getting through an incredible amount of work. Finally, we have Felicity Buchan, and a minister at DLUC, who has been driving through most of the legislation. Now, when Bob Blackman was starting this exercise, he liaised with housing charity Crisis, who instructed barrister Justin Bates of Landmark Chambers to draft the legislation, and considering the tight timescales, has done a pretty good job, although I believe there are some areas which need addressing. So there are three main areas to the bill and two minor sections that deal with information and interpretations. I'm going to be covering the three major sections, that is 1, advice, strategy and standards, 2, licensing, and 3, planning and homelessness. I will just make some observations on the minor sections. I'm going to share the headlines. I'm not going to go through it clause by clause, but I might make some personal comments, particularly where I consider the drafting of the legislation a little weak. So firstly, under advice, strategy and standards, we're going to see the creation of a new supported housing advisory panel, which the Secretary of State is under an obligation to create once the bill is passed. Well, it is passed. And this will advise the Secretary of State on matters relating to supported housing. Now, the Act defines who is to be appointed. The reason why I've got some stars there. The legislation says at least one person who appears to the Secretary of State to represent the interests of registered providers. 2, at least one person who appears to the Secretary of State to interest the interests of local authorities. 3, the interests of social service authorities. 4, the interests of charities providing supported exempt accommodation. And 5, the interests of residents or potential residents of supported exempt accommodation. But then we have this beautiful let-out clause, quote, but the Secretary of State is not required to appoint different persons under each of those sections, which essentially means that the Secretary of State could appoint one person to represent the lot. Of course, he would never do that. A second key component of the strategic element of the bill is the fact that local authorities will be required to conduct supported housing reviews. And this will be a duty that will come into effect in 5 yearly cycles. And they will be required to produce a strategy on matters identified in guidance by the Secretary of State. Now, the third and really critical part of this Act is that the Secretary of State now has the power to publish national supported housing standards. So this goes back to a commitment that the Minister made to introduce this type of standard. And what the Act says is that these standards may address either the type or condition of the premises and the provision of care, support and supervision. And at committee stage, Felicity Buchan also committed to consult on whether standards should include issues to do with the referral process. So we've got a broad sense of what the national standards will cover, but the detail is to follow. And there is a duty on the Secretary of State to keep these standards under review. So one of the key areas being introduced by the Act is powers for local authorities to introduce supported housing licensing schemes in their areas. And in the Act, this is framed as a permissive function for the Secretary of State, who may introduce regulations requiring licensing of supported exempt accommodation. What this means in effect is that a local authority may decide not to have a licensing scheme, but the Secretary of State may require the local authority to do so. But there is an obligation on the Secretary of State to provide a progress report after a year on progress towards implementing licensing. And the Minister has already given a commitment to lay regulations with 18 months. It's important to note that any regulations on licensing must be approved by both Houses of Parliament, what's known as the affirmative procedure. So there's a layer of scrutiny, further scrutiny built in there. Now, the way in which the bill has been framed, local authorities will be required to opt in to creating licensing unless they're required to do so by a direction from the Secretary of State. So they may decide not to. The assumption is at this stage is that local authorities will be able to choose whether or not to have a licensing scheme. So, for example, a local authority may have only one supported housing operation in their area and therefore would not involve themselves in a full-blown licensing scheme. However, there is a possible catch-22 situation. If it's not lawful to run a supported housing operation without a licence and the local authority decides not to implement a licensing regime, then you could see allegations of NIMBYism certainly could arise. And the bill also makes clear that any licensing conditions will be linked to the national supported housing standards. And these may relate to standard or use of accommodation, the provision of care, support or supervision, and that the standards may also relate to the way needs are assessed by the provider. So there are a number of stipulations on the face of the Act that shape what these regulations may look like. They include things like how application for licenses are made, varied or revoked, how local authorities may enforce the licensing regime. Importantly, provision for the Secretary of State to exempt or passport certain categories of provider from the need to hold a license. This was an important provision to try and minimise bureaucracy wherever possible, so that providers who are already subject to suitable alternative forms of oversight would not need to hold a licence. And that means local authorities can focus on parts of the sector that are considered to be most problematic. There are also powers to allow the Secretary of State to make stipulations regarding fee charging and also the appeals process for licensing, and the Secretary of State can also introduce regulations concerning what the regime says about landlords having to be fit and proper persons. There's also provisions allowing local authorities to disapply the requirement to hold an HMO licence if a supported housing licence is required. So the policy intent behind that was to ensure that providers don't need to hold two licenses or more. And the presumption is that the supported housing license would take precedence in future because it's a more comprehensive licensing regime that also addresses care, support and supervision alongside the accommodation standards. Indeed, in a letter I received from DLUC dated 18th of August 2023, they say that, quote, the intention is for supported housing licensing to supersede HMO licensing where relevant. Now, it's obvious that the government wants to move to a single licensing scheme, but I'm mused. If only one licensing regime, no HMO, maybe no registered provider status. And if no registered provider status, what does that mean for subsidy? There's also a really important provision in the Act that allows for the Secretary of State to remove or restrict housing benefit entitlement in association with the issue of whether or not providers hold a license. So the policy intent behind this was to disincentivize rogue operators from seeking to enter the market to exploit the higher rates. So the thinking here is that it may be possible to link the licensing regime to your ability to claim exempt rates of housing benefit where licensing exists. And that provision will also be considered as a provision to attach to national supported housing standards. But obviously, that's going to be subject to detailed consultation and discussion. It's also important to notice that local authorities must exercise their licensing functions with regard to any guidance issued by the Secretary of State. So that's a very brief overview of the key licensing components. Consultation. The Secretary of State must consult before exercising licensing power. And it's worth being aware that there are two consultation duties on the face of the Act. The first relates explicitly to supported exempt housing, which was the focus of the intention of bringing this bill forward. But DLUC was also concerned that we may also start to see problems arising in other parts of the supported housing sector, what the housing benefit regulations call specified accommodation. So the department, DLUC, proposed that they should also have the ability to extend the regime, the licensing regime, to other forms of specified accommodation if it becomes apparent that problems were developing in that sector. So, for example, managed accommodation. But the Act separates these out and makes clear that in the first instance, licensing would only apply to the supported exempt sector, and there would be a need to review the process and a further consultation process if the Secretary of State believes the case for extending the licensing regime. It's also important to note that there are statutory consultees named on the face of the bill, now the Act: the National Housing Federation, individual local authorities, and the Regulator of Social Housing. I do believe that originally the Local Government Association, the LGA, was named, but they said, no, thank you. But the Secretary of State has given a very clear commitment that the consultation process supporting the development of the bill will be comprehensive. And he has said that he wants to ensure that supported housing providers and residents have their voices heard through the consultation process. There's also another part of the consultation requirements in the Act, and that's the question of whether licensing as an effective way of enforcing the national supported housing standards. Maybe licensing might not do the job. So they've created the provisions that assume that local authorities can opt into licensing, which means they don't have to have it, unless they are directed by the Secretary of State to do so. But what they wanted to ensure was that there would be a conversation about other enforcement mechanisms for the national support housing standards should the local authority choose not to implement licensing. And what was agreed and what is written into the Act is that there will be a formal consultation process to consider the question. And there was some discussion at committee about whether there might, for example, include things like improvement notices for local authorities to use without having to create a licensing scheme. And that's a subject of further consultation. The Minister also said that she expects the advisory panel to have a role in considering the case for some form of national regulatory oversight in overseeing the improvement of standards. So that would be in addition to the option of local authority licensing. It was originally intended to consider the case for a new planning use class for supported housing in order to enable local authorities to prevent rogue operators from setting up in the first place by requiring them to apply for planning permission. There's been considerable discussion about the merits of this approach, and the way that the Act is ended up is that the Secretary of State must review the effect of licensing after 3 years, and at that point consider the case for additional planning powers to be introduced. So the Act itself does not introduce any new planning powers relating to this sector, but it flags up that this is a matter that may need consideration. The presumption being that they look at how licensing and the national standards framework work in practice and whether they have the desired effect. In my view, a new planning use class would be considered the nuclear option. There are plenty of other tools that can be used. In local plans, for example, a saturation area can be defined that is restricted. Another really important part of the bill is the provision of on intentional homelessness. So the Act introduces an amendment to Section 191 of the Housing Act 96 dealing with intentional homelessness, which says that a person cannot be found intentionally homeless if they leave supported housing because of poor quality housing or support, but where the accommodation also doesn't meet the national supported housing standards. It's an important protection for people who are afraid to leave supported housing, afraid to leave controlled by rogue operators because they're told that they're threatened with a suggestion that they could be found intentionally homeless. That's going to go. There then follows detail on data sharing, which if it really interests you, take a copy of the Act and curl up on your sofa. There then follows a new definition of supported exempt accommodation, which includes the existing exempt accommodation, etc., now extends to managed properties, refuges, and local authority hostels. In terms of funding, there is obviously provision, as I've said, for fees to be charged for licensing, with some costs therefore being recovered through fees, which will in turn be the subject of regulatory parameters set by DLUC. But it's worth noting, as I said earlier, providers would only be subject to one form of licensing and therefore one form of charging. And the Minister also acknowledged that there is likely to be new burdens funding, and she suggested is going to focus on setup costs. It's absolutely critical that this is properly resourced and that local authorities are given the resources they need to implement the provisions, and also to support the legitimate parts of the supported housing sector to respond. I mean, we're going to need to respond to this. We all need help. The bill has received royal assent, so it's now law. The government is committed to begin consultation shortly, and my guess it's starting now. We can expect licensing regulations within 18 months, which we can assume implies that the national supported housing standards will be in place by then, which essentially means we're looking at regulations being laid towards the end of 2024 probably, and potentially a phased implementation for existing providers into 2025. Well, thanks for that. Let me conclude. Keep talking and engaging with your landlords. Best practices, lessons learned, and benefit people will be advised to talk with the licensing people, probably the housing department, private sector housing, something like that. Share your concerns, share your suggestions. Once again, thank you.